Jason McEldowney. I'm council member at large here in Commerce City, and we'll introduce quickly my peers to my left and right. Councilman Jim Benson represents our Ward 2 area, the northeast corner of our community, in essence. Mr. Douglas, Steve Douglas, newly elected this November, is also an at-large representative. And then Mr. Rick Teeter represents our Ward 4 community, which is essentially the southeast quadrant of our community. That said, if we can go around the horn, I'll start with our Deputy City Manager.
Staff has really just been here for support. We're going to have the community kind of run things. Right now, the staff is really not going to be at the table per se.
Thanks. Yep, and just that little switch on top there.
Okay, I'm Wes Wilson with Be the Change. Thanks for inviting us tonight. Let me say at the outset that due to some scheduling problems, Phil Doe and I may substitute for each other with one of us sitting up here. But I'm with a non-profit statewide organization advocating for improved oil and gas development.
Welcome, thank you.
I'm Dave Neslin. I'm the director of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. We're the state agency that regulates oil and gas development in Colorado.
Thank you and welcome.
My name is Matt Lepore. I'm an attorney with the law firm of Beatty and Wozniak, and I represent Hillcorp.
Thank you.
Is that on? I'm Michael Scanlon. I'm one of the citizens here.
I'm Dan Stapleton. I'm another resident of the Commerce City area.
I'm Brandon Baker, Halliburton Energy Services.
Thank you.
Andrew Casper with KOGA. We're an industry trade association.
I'm Chris Castillion with Anadarko. I manage all our government and community relations in the Rockies here.
Phil Barber, attorney, special counsel with the City of Commerce City.
Well, thank you, everyone. Tom, did you want to go ahead and we can introduce the remainder of our senior staff that's in attendance?
Ms. Ryan Cordero with Commerce City Government Relations. I think everyone here knows.
Alan Cullen, Commerce City Office of Emergency Management.
Chris Kramer, Commerce City Planning Division.
Karen Stevens, Assistant City Attorney.
Jim Hayes, Community Development Director and Interim Economic Development Director.
And since we have a low audience attendance, we'll go ahead and have them introduce themselves.
I'm Marty Zemsik. I'm with Shea Homes.
My mouth is full, but I'm still Phil Doe. I'm Environmental Issues Director for Be the Change.
Again, thank you, everyone. We're going to go ahead and just give a brief kickoff, and then, as I said, we'll go through the agenda and move through. I want to respect everyone's time tonight. Just to kind of set the stage, tonight is not an end. It is a beginning, and we thank you for your presence here tonight. Hope for a rich and mature dialogue and a discovery effort. Council a couple weeks ago, a couple of you were present at our council meeting, requested that we institute a committee to work with the oil and gas community and with our citizens and with other experts in the oil and gas space to look at areas where we needed to consider changes to our land development code to ensure that we had the best interests of our citizens in mind while enabling the oil and gas community to do business in our community. So with that said, you guys are all here tonight, and we appreciate your participation. I expect that through these meetings, we will end up in potential breakout meetings or looking at other experts that we might want to bring in and consult with for questions that may come up. Ultimately, our goal is to reach a consensus on a set of recommendations that we would carry back to the full council for approval and adoption in our land development code. And so again, this is not a by vote 10 votes for, 2 votes against makes it show up on the list. This is really intended to be a by consensus effort and ensure that those items that go on have buy-in from our community members and from our other stakeholders in the discussion. Again, I think something that's also important to point out is this is not a set of decisions that we're likely to come to overnight. We've put roughly 4 meetings on the calendar. If we get to a point in 4 meetings where we feel like we've got what we need, well, great. But I suspect that we might need some additional time, and so would look for input and insight from those here as to what the appropriate duration of this endeavor might be. Again, just to add, none of us on council, and certainly not our community members, are expert on oil and gas, so hence your presence here. Certainly there are more questions than answers in all of our minds about the industry and the potential impact and potential risk to our community. So to do right by our community, we want to ask those questions and come to a firm and whole understanding. And make sure that we're taking the right steps to protect our community. Not that you guys won't, on your own, do your fair share in that regard, but we certainly want to make sure that we're not missing any steps in that regard. So with that said, to the community members that are present, again, thank you very much for your attendance tonight. We know you're engaged for a reason. You have questions, you have concerns, and we want to, through you, hear what our community concerns are and make sure that they're taken into consideration as we look to enhance that land development code. So again, thank you for coming to the table tonight. Again, as I suggested to those of you from industry, similarly, thank you for your presence tonight. Again, we want to ensure that you're able to profitably pursue your activities here in our community, yet mitigating any negative impacts where possible for our community. Again, back to the thought of tonight as sort of step one. The agenda that was set and sent out in draft form earlier in the week, you may have seen, based on some feedback received over the last several days, a couple changes have been proposed to that agenda to focus more on clarification of purpose of this body, deprioritize some of the presentation content and set that aside for our next meeting. But in front of you, if you can just scan through that agenda, we would, again, we've already covered the introductions. We've covered, in essence, who you are, who you represent. I think we need to come back to the input on outcome, your desired outcome and your biggest concern. So we'll go back around if everyone's on board with that next. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about approval of the charter and sort of the operating protocols. What are sort of the rules of the road as far as conducting ourselves in this committee? And then we would look to a couple of informal presentations, one from city staff on our land use code and regulatory opportunities and constraints relative to what we can really affect from a locality perspective versus what falls under the domain of Colorado state regs and or the county. And then again, we would open up to public comment. If we see additional folks arrive, we would open up that for comment. One of the other items that we'd like to see raised by those in attendance would be any data needs. So if there are informational items that would be helpful for you, either from the city or for our citizenry from the city or from industry, if those requests could be placed tonight, we would hope that folks could help facilitate the delivery of those requests in advance of the next meeting to give folks time to consider those in advance of when we regroup. Any questions, comments, concerns on that as our run of show? Okay, great. Well, then let's head back around the table, if we will. Just again, remind us your name and who you represent, and then give us a sense of what you hope to see as an outcome or what your biggest concern is relative to your the community that you represent. So if we want to, Les, maybe have you start.
Well, as I said, I'm Wes Wilson. I'm formerly with the Environmental Protection Agency. I'd worked 35 years for EPA here in Denver. And since retiring almost 2 years ago now, I've worked with a number of nonprofit organizations who have environmental concerns over oil and gas drilling. What I'd like to see is a full range of possible city conditions considered. ranging from an outright ban on drilling within the city to aggressive monitoring to have the industry prove what it claims and the state prove what it claims, that it's not contaminating water, and especially air. My focus is really on hazardous air pollutants that come off of these large commercial facilities because of the unknown products they use and create, and especially in the case where they have open pits allowed to be released into the community. For that, I'm going to be recommending that the city expressly consider ambient air monitoring close to the site, which would clearly not be a conflict with the state rules.
Thank you.
I'm Dave Neslin, and again, I guess I work for a nonprofit organization too. I work for the state of Colorado. I think I've got a couple of goals here. One is to help educate the city about the state regulatory program for oil and gas. And it's obviously it's a complicated program. We've been around for 60 years. We've got an extensive staff. We had a little bit of discussion at your hearing about this a couple of weeks ago, but I think there's more to share and more to talk about. And in terms of an ideal outcome from my standpoint, I think, as I mentioned at the earlier hearing, I think we've shared the same objective, which is to ensure that the development of this resource occurs in a responsible manner that's going to protect the environment, protect public health. We want to try to accomplish that collaboratively with the city. We want to try to work together to avoid conflict and duplication and ensure that the regulatory program is effective and efficient.
Thanks, David.
Again, my name is Matt Lepore. I represent Hillcorp. I'm an attorney. I think Hillcorp's goals are to make sure that the city also understands the state regulatory regime and what the city's regulatory role is within that regime as it relates to oil and gas, to try to drive any city regulations to make sure that they're based on good information, sound science, that they're fair and balanced, and to provide whatever information I can with respect to Hillcorp's business and its intentions.
Thank you, Matt.
Well, we're off to a good start here, I guess, because we all agree on the same things, it sounds like, so far. And I should quickly say, Dave, Senator Hodge said a lot of good things about you, so that's a good start for you in my eyes. You know, I'm going to be brief. I would just say that we got off on the wrong foot here, that the wrong way to come into my neighborhood is to start drilling at 6 a.m. and I find out at 5:30 on a Saturday afternoon. We got off on a bad start. So all this good talk about effective and efficient regulations sounds great to me, but I have to wonder when we get off on the wrong foot like that. I mean, if I was going to come pollute your backyard, I would come down and let you know, hey, I've got the legal right to come in and pollute your backyard, and I'm going to be doing that. I just think that's common decency to do, and we live there. These are our homes. Our property values are already sinking, and we have a lot of concerns.
I have to echo what Michael and the gentleman from Hillcorp said. I think we have a lot of the same goals. I'd like to make as many safety features as we can to make this as safe as possible that make sense. You know, I don't see a need to, just do something for the fun of it because it looks good. I would like to make sure it does make sense and does make things safer. And I think there is room for that to make things safer. Basically, my biggest concern is the quality of life, property values, that we've got clean air around us and clean water, and that the soil is clean. And, things I've seen so far lead me to believe that sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. I believe, might have been Earthworks website said that 1 in 100 wells will end very poorly. And you think, 35,000 wells are going to be drilled every year, they say? That's a lot of bad wells, and I don't want them to be in Commerce City, in Adams County, well, anywhere in the country for that matter. But all I can really influence is this area here, so let's start with this. And my point is not to drive up your cost or make it impossible, but just to do some reasonable things so we can keep from having those disastrous results. Thanks.
There?
There you go.
I'm Brandon Baker with Halliburton Energy Services, and I'm a technical manager for them. And really, the reason I'm here is I'd like to help educate, share some of the things that I know. I've been an engineer for them for about 10 years now, and I just would like to, really it goes back to my biggest concern or issue is just hope that we can come to a resolution and something that we decide on that's responsible and something that's made off of factual information and the best information that's out there and on what's really happening, and just make sure we make some decisions too that don't make life tougher for the people that do live in those communities. So just make some good common sense decisions and get some good information out there.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Andrew Casper with Koga. I think what we'd like to see here is a responsible development of oil and gas resource. It's abundant here in Colorado, and it provides tremendous benefit both to the economy and to our dependence on foreign energy. What we would like to do is provide the education and answer any questions and clear up the misinformation that's out there. There's a lot of information if you look in the papers and listen to certain presentations that we would like to clear up and provide the factual basis for that and the science to back that up. And I guess as an outcome, what we'd like to see is a clear set of rules to follow that industry that's workable for industry. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Chris Castillion. I manage the government and community relations for Anadarko Petroleum Corporation, probably one of the largest producers in Colorado at this point, and the bulk of our operations are up here in Weld County in Colorado. Recovering lawyer, don't even carry a yellow legal tablet around like David or any of the other real lawyers in the room, but I'm on the 10th step of my 12-step program at this point. I'm a fourth-generation Coloradan. I believe in what we do as an industry. I wouldn't work for an industry or a company that didn't take the environmental standards very seriously. I've had a very checkered past. I've worked for local governments. I've worked for the state government as director of the State Land Board at one point in my career. Represented Colorado Counties Incorporated. I feel like there's an opportunity for us to move this discussion forward in a collaborative way, and I think David's been very helpful in many of the other jurisdictions that we're having this very same conversation in. The company I work for has probably got the most experience. We have 5,100 active wells just a little bit north of here, so we've been drilling wells and making sure that we're not impacting our neighbors unduly, and certainly not polluting the state that we all live and work in here. So I want to make sure that you all base your decisions off of accurate factual information and not hearsay or allegations, that you all make good decisions representing the constituents that you have that live out here in Commerce City, and we're happy to provide whatever information we can to make sure that you're doing that. So
thanks, Chris.
Phil Barber, I guess I haven't been on the 12-step program. In fact, I'd like to say I'm very happy to be a lawyer involved in this discussion, because I think this is a place where a lawyer can do real good for the clients and hopefully for the community. I've practiced for about 30 years, almost exclusively in oil and gas law, and I was even referred to in the Denver Post as an expert the other day. And I don't know where that came from, but somebody thought it. Okay. What I would like to come out of this is for hard questions to be asked by everybody here of each other as to why things can't be done a particular way or why things should be done a particular way. We'll hear probably some arguments that they can't be done a particular way because the state has regulations that either allow it or don't allow it. So I will be here to advise the city as to whether I think that's an accurate position or not, because I will confess that my position is some of those questions have been answered, but a lot of them are open. This issue, you'll hear an issue of preemption, and that's essentially what Director Neslin's group will espouse whenever he thinks it's appropriate, that this is an area where the commission has spoken or should speak, and there will be some areas where local government clearly has a role to regulate. And so my job will be to act as a lawyer and to advise the city when and if those disputes ever come up. And I anticipate that there will be some butting of heads about what the city can and can't do, so I'll try to act as an expert and in good faith advise the city so it can do right by its citizens, and that's what I hope. I hope we get, actually, let me finish it. I think this is also a place where we can negotiate. I think this is a place where industry and the city and the experts around the table have a chance to discuss some of these things and keep them out of the courts, because that is certainly a place where they could end up if somebody feels that their toes are being stepped on or that their rights are being infringed. So I invite us all to look for solutions rather than roadblocks.
Thank you, Philip.
Sure. And I'm Jim Benson on the City Council. I'm also an attorney, but I've only had about 2 oil and gas cases in the past 30 years, so I'm not an expert. You know what I want to see, with the help of Mr. Barber, I want to push the envelope up to state preemption as far as our regulations and rules are concerned. And we're going to rely heavily on the advice of Mr. Barber as to how we're going to do that. Another thing I'm concerned about is putting water that comes back up one of these fracking holes into a pit. Whether it's sealed or whatever, I don't see how you can seal something like that. There's going to be evaporation. It's going to blow across the landscape, pollute the surface. The water needs to be brought back up and tanked off someplace else. I don't know where you're going to put it, because somebody's going to object wherever you put it, I guess. But
China. We could do it in China.
I'm sorry?
We could send it to China and trade it for all the toys we bring over
Would be
here.
good if in the tanker going over there, it didn't rot out the inside of the tanker. But so that's sort of where I'm coming from. I think that there are only so many things that we can do as a municipality, but we need to push that envelope and make sure that we've got everything covered. So, thank you.
Go ahead.
Okay. Steve Douglas, City Council at Large, and I'm here on City Council because I was elected by the citizens here, and my job is to protect the citizens, to look after them, to make sure that our role as City Council is to put them first. And, as far as the oil shale's been there for years. It's going to be there for a long time. So for us to rush in and figure out how we can make amends to things, and for you guys to go ahead and do what you need to do, to me is premature. So the question I have for you guys is, have any of you guys do you have any results as far as fracking near an arsenal? That's my question. When that comes up, that's on my agenda. There is, we have the arsenal here in our city. We also have the northern area is supposed to be built out residential, and I wasn't on the Citizens Advisory Committee. So on there for almost 2 years, we went over just about everything of how that northern area is supposed to be built out. Now, one time, did oil fracking come up? So, there's some things here that's missing. We have some large gaps that we need to fill, and I don't have that information, and I felt that we've had 2 weeks right now. We haven't had a city council meeting. We haven't had any speak and all that as far as council, just because of the way our council sits. So as far as being here tonight, we're going to use this to our advantage to get things out and to ask those tough questions. But, my position right now is to protect the citizens.
Rick Teeter, new city council member also. I kind of go along with what Steve just said here. I was a retired fire chief from the Rocky Mountain Arsenal. I spent 25 years out there. I know what's out there, and I know where it's at. And it's still, it still can be a very dangerous situation if we get involved in that Rocky Mountain Arsenal. We need to stay away from there.
Thanks. So 2 things before I give my comments. I just wanted to acknowledge Councilman J.D. Carson, who has shown up. Just make sure that she's acknowledged as being in attendance. And remind folks who have joined, we are broadcasting live on our web stream, and this will be available for replay on the city website, and ultimately will cycle on our Channel 8 feed on Comcast Channel 8. I think I touched on it a little bit in my opening comments. My real goal here is to, I think a quick success was to bring you guys together and begin this discussion. So quite simply, I want to make sure that you doing business in Commerce City can do business in Commerce City. You have a legal right to do so. We need to respect that and facilitate that. But ultimately, as we've heard, we have a very serious responsibility to our community to keep them safe. And so that is sort of paramount in my mind as we move through these discussions. So with that, I will believe we are at a point to talk briefly about operating protocols in our go-forward meeting format. Again, we're going to keep this as casual as we can, but just, basic housekeeping, rules of order, be polite, don't attacking people in this discussion. We want to keep this constructive. We want to keep this adult. We need to try and limit our bias and be objective, be frank about conflicts of interest, and give the process a chance. We want to give the process a chance to work. So we can't come in and assume that oil and gas is wrong or that the citizens are absolutely right. We need to make sure that we're really balancing the facts, and I appreciate everyone's consistent perspective in the regard of we want to be factual, we want to get full information and make decisions in that sound manner. As far as a meeting schedule goes, I think, Tom, as you had put forth, looking at 1 meeting a week over at least the next roughly 4 weeks, we've had some comments about the time. 5 o'clock is awkward. A, you've got traffic. B, we all have a day job. Some of you are here on behalf of your day job, obviously, and so this is the right place to be as a result. Others have to make that transition. So would be open to any comments on scheduling, day of week, time of day, that would make it most convenient for you to be able to participate. Any, I guess to make it simple, any obligation or objections in general to the Thursday 5 o'clock time slot?
I was recommending that we do the 6:30 like the city council meetings, so that people that do work in the day could stop off and take a break, maybe go home real quick and then come back, whatever might be appropriate. Like I said, the city council meetings at that time, it just seems like it's maybe a good time.
And it's a sound recommendation. I think the only other thought is we do have the benefit by starting at 5 of having a good complement of city staff on hand, and a marginal extension to their day versus an excessive extension to their day. We also get the ability to have them set up the room potentially during city hours. So I guess if we don't have any other major conflicts with 5, I would suggest that we at least stick with that for the next several, and then we can obviously reconsider if that will work.
I'm okay with it. It's just some of the resident members were mentioning that, but my schedule is pretty flexible.
Okay.
For me personally, earlier in the week would be better than Thursday and Friday for at least this month.
Okay. And I know we've also got to account for meeting room conflicts. We have a planning commission and we have other activities that are going to occur in this room. So I don't know offhand if other nights would be problematic.
The planners might be able to help out with this, but I think first and second Tuesday evenings, we've got Planning Commission and Board of Adjustment. Derby, is that in this room as well? Or is, okay. And then the other challenge we have is this room also doubles as our council chamber, or our court chamber, and we have court on Wednesdays and Thursdays.
What time on Wednesday?
It depends if they have a trial or not. Typically, they're done about the 4:30, 5 o'clock time frame. That allows us, it doesn't take long to get this setup done. I can check with them as far as do they have any trials scheduled, because that might be what would make it go longer, and see if Wednesdays may be a better day. We can also, if this is about the size of group we're going to have, we've got another room we can do it in. It just doesn't allow us as easy to have the microphones and to film it. So what I'll do is check with staff in the court on what Wednesdays look like, and then maybe send out an email. It sounds like it's either Wednesday or Thursday, given what's going on with other meetings in this room. Is that
We could take it week by week if you want, but Wednesday, the 11th, if you could look into that, next Wednesday would be a good change.
okay?
And actually the next Wednesday, too.
Okay. We'll take a look at that, and we'll send out an email.
Just passed around for folks' reference, if you didn't have that handy through email, this was the rough charter that staff put together on operating protocols and charter. Did everybody have a chance to at least give this a cursory look through? Any key concerns, comments, questions? I think this is really want to make sure we spend some time and clarify or add or remove anything that's objectionable or missed. Les?
Let me speak about your interest in achieving, advancing ideas of achieving this. Worthwhile, and with all due respect to the stakeholders here from the industry, I think achieving that with such clear financial terms. And so I'm suggesting that the four representatives of industry not be included when it comes to
Okay. Any other comments on that point?
I would say we are part of the group. That's why we're here, the four industry members. So that should be taken into consideration as well. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I missed the very front end of your comment.
The four industry representatives are part of this group, so the rules should apply to us as well.
Okay.
Well, by my comment there, this is Wes Wilson again, I didn't mean to exclude them. Certainly their information is going to be necessary, particularly from the two parts of the industry that are planning on activities within the city. But what my mere suggestion is this: when it comes time for you to seek consensus, that you not include these four members with such clear and direct financial conflict.
Maybe the residents of Commerce City and those of you that are elected should be the ones making those recommendations. If that's the direction that we're going to go, we can show up here and provide testimony and go home. I guess we don't need to sit around the table and waste your time or our time if we're not going to be, a substantive part of this conversation. So I guess you all are elected to make those decisions. So, basically you should almost exclude virtually everybody else from participating if that's the direction that we're going to go for this.
Yeah, and just to speak to that, because I think the intent is to have, again, all hands actively participating in this discussion. Ultimately, again, the list of items that get carried forward to council won't be done through a vote, and the final determination on what action gets taken relative to the land development code will be based on a full council vote. So this committee will essentially carry forward a list of items that, based on the discussion, based on the questions and facts reviewed, seem to make the most sense to proceed with. Now that would then get taken to council and go through the typical process that would entail, and so that would open up I would assume another round of discussion more than likely, and ultimately a vote. And so it would be that vote that would ultimately determine what action gets taken. I would hope, and I think a couple of the comments seem to suggest this, that we may find things through the course of discussion that are no-brainers. And industry may say, hey, this is something that we want to go do. Or GOCCC may say, hey, you know what, this is a great idea, let's do it. And I think I even got a sense that some of that brainstorming was occurring even in the meeting that folks participated in a couple weeks ago. How do we use this discussion to identify those things and carry those out and enact those on the fly? The ultimate goal, obviously, to arrive at our land development code update. So with that said, and I understand the concern, certainly do, I guess my personal take would be it's going to be critical that we do have that broad buy-in. We can certainly take items that have a clear slant one way or the other and make that clear, so if they get carried forward, that is made known to the council as they make a consideration. I don't know, I'll defer to my peers on council if that makes some sense.
Well, that does make sense to me. I agree with what you said. I'd like to ask, besides our residents, attendees at this meeting, how many people would consider yourselves environmentalists like Mr. Wilson would be? Okay. Well, I know you should be kind of in the middle as the COGCC. The others of you work within the industry, and I don't know that I would include you in the term environmentalist. And I think he's got a good point that we need to sort of even up the votes here so that there can be a full discussion. I look at you as being, I hope that you're neutral because you represent the COGCC. But
No, I'd say it a little different way. I'd say that we have obligations on both sides of
right, well, that's
that
what
discussion.
I mean. That's what I mean. Maybe neutral is not the word. It should be nonpartisan.
Jim, years ago, the FAA used to be a dual mission of promoting aviation and regulating. And they found that didn't work out because sometimes they were trying to push to get more people to fly, to get, expand aviation, and at the same time regulating it. So they stripped out the promoting part. I think the problem is the industry here has both roles still, and it seems to me there's a leaning towards the promoting, and that's understandable because it might have said you need to provide a stable relationship or a stable situation for a business to thrive. A business is not going to come into place they don't know what they can expect. So I understand that, but I don't think we should assume that the COGCC is going to be neutral. I wouldn't ask them to be either way, just it is what it is, but I wouldn't put them on the neutral side.
I would say neutral is not a good word, non-biased. It might be a better
I don't know if
word,
I'd even do
although
that, but
everybody thinks that COGCC has some bias towards the industry. Maybe that's true, maybe it isn't, but we'll find out. But
well, it came on the meeting on the 19th in defense of the industry, so I have to kind of say that it's probably biased a little that way. And I apologize, I don't mean it's bad, it's just that's the way I find it. Maybe it's my opinion, maybe it's wrong, but like I said, I don't have a problem with it. As long as I understand where the relationship is, I'm good with that.
I understand what you mean. How can they promote the industry and still protect the environmental rights of the people? That's
Right,
tough.
and in a perfect world, the state would separate those duties and have maybe a chamber of commerce that promoted it and a regulatory agency that regulated it. But for now, this is what we got. Is that correct? Did you promote it and regulate it?
No, we don't promote the industry. We don't allocate any staff to promoting the industry. We don't do any advertising. We don't have any functions that involve promoting the industry. So, and I don't mean this disrespectfully to you, if there's some particular facts you could point me to that lead you to conclude that that's part of our job or that that's the way we come across. What we've been charged by the legislature with is to facilitate the development, the responsible and balanced development of the state's oil and gas resources, okay?
Well, to me, that says promotion. When you facilitate the development, that's promotion. Again, like I said, it's okay. I'm all right with that.
But there's another piece to that, which is, are we saying, are we affirmatively promoting development of oil and gas? No, but we don't have staff who do that. We don't market oil and gas. We don't promote oil and gas. We don't initiate any oil and gas development. We regulate people who are attempting to develop oil and gas. Do we foreclose it? No. Do we rubber stamp it in all events? No. We try to ensure that it's done in a responsible manner. The same way your zoning commission or your city council regulates other kinds of real estate development, right? I wouldn't characterize you as promoters.
Right. And just to jump in, I want to be very careful about falling into a discussion where we're identifying how many people stand on one side of the line or the other. The point is, everybody here is a stakeholder in this discussion, and we need to be respectful of those positions. I think part of what needs to occur through these discussions is an education. We each need to understand more about the other so that we have a firm basis from which to make an opinion. So I want to be very careful about falling into that as a discussion point. And so I think there is a valid question about, are there stakeholder groups that are not at the table that would make sense to include in this discussion to help further enrich our discussion? I know citizens have suggested entities like Tri-County Health or other health or environmental entities that may help provide some other perspectives. The other consideration there is perhaps we identify a list of those experts, and as items surface in our discussion, we engage them to come in and provide input, to provide perspective for us as a group, and use those inputs to then help further the discussion, come to a point of agreement, disagreement, whatever that might be. But I guess sort of two things. Are there people that should be at this table on a week in, week out basis while we're meeting that are missing? And I would open that up for comment.
Go ahead.
I like to say, as far as having a balanced approach here, that's what the fear is from the citizens. By looking at our membership here, it is, if we want to call it, a weight issue. Because David, I look at you, and I hear you speak, and I hear and understand what you represent. But what's coming out here, as far as you speaking, weighs heavily towards, as far as support for oil and gas, which you really should remain neutral to make sure there's a balance there, to make sure that they're doing their job right. And here in Colorado, things should be different. And matter of fact, as far as like we have boards and commissions, we have zoning, we have planning, housing, and all that. We might have to have a commission for something like this here, because if this is coming in, we need to have a better understanding where we sit and have that discussion. So tonight, of course, we're not going to answer all the questions, but I think there's other stakeholders that should be here at the table to answer questions. Environmentally, we should have more of an impact, because we're talking about water, air. There's no one here with that. You may have the knowledge of that, but we don't have that support as far as those groups being here. So this is a start here, and we might have to take this to the state, have the state involved as well. So I appreciate this initial meeting here, and we do need other stakeholders here. But it's a start tonight.
So I think just to restate the question, and it might be helpful to clarify again, I think what the intent of the body is, and perhaps we jump ahead to the presentation from Mr. Neslin and from the city to help clarify what the scope of the Land Development Code is, what the formal definition of the role of the COGCC is, and then use that to help, again, I think reaffirm what the breadth and sort of domain of this discussion will be, which is what are we going to be talking about that will influence how oil and gas occurs inside of Commerce City, where the COGCC rule set ends and where our rule set should begin. So with that said, I will take the liberty to jump ahead to the agenda a little bit. Tom, do you want to go ahead and, who are we going to have speak to that? Is that going to be Jim? Or Karen?
Barbara's going to talk a little bit about what we can do. Oh, that's okay. Thank you. Moments. Chris, do you have the handouts? I want to make sure everybody has a copy of what's in our Land Development Code currently. What Chris is handing out are the standards for operating an oil and gas subsurface extraction in Commerce City. These rules apply to new operations as opposed to ones that are already existing. The other piece that's not in here, that's part of a separate section of our land development code, is that any new subsurface extraction would need to get a use by permit through our Board of Adjustment. There are certain standards that apply and standards about when those permits will be granted. And it's only allowed in the industrial zone properties as well as the public zone properties. So that's kind of the basic standards that we have right now. I understand from Phil that they're fairly low-level standards, and we probably can do more, so he's going to talk a little bit about that.
For the citizens here, you're going to hear some talk that you probably aren't familiar with, and essentially when we talk about preemption, which will come up, I think, repeatedly through these discussions if I'm not wrong, it means that it's like the federal government can make laws that the state cannot override. The state legislature has enabled the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission to promulgate certain rules which have to be harmonized with whatever a local entity does. And I think that's where a lot of the discussion will be, is how can we harmonize what the citizens in the city would like to do with what they're able to do under the constraints that this preemption doctrine implies. So I think that there are areas where that can occur, where the city can take a lead and can take a role. I think it's really sort of a line-by-line, issue-by-issue situation where some of it can be negotiated, some of it we may not be able to agree on. I just jotted down some of the main issues that I think that we should try to address in greater detail through the city's regulations, because they are fairly bare bones. Water is a very key issue, and one of the stakeholders that is not at this table are stakeholders, somebody from the city's water department, somebody who could address how they would prefer water that's brought to a well site. There's estimates that 3 to 5 million gallons of water are brought to frack one well. How they would like that water dealt with. Then there's water that is removed from a well and it's contaminated to a much greater extent than the water that's put into the well. How would the water community in this city like to see that dealt with? I think that one of the issues I'm hoping we can have a very honest discussion about with industry is, what can you do to make the city feel comfortable that what you're putting into the ground is not going to harm the water table and the water supply of this city. You'll hear discussions about green fracking fluid or green fracking techniques, and so I think that's would be an excellent area for us to talk about. So water is one issue. Mr. Wilson mentioned air pollution. These wells obviously emit certain hydrocarbons and vapors and gases. Another issue that we would want to look at, I think, with the regulations is transportation. A well can have as many as 500 to 1,000 trips of very large tanker trucks per well. And if you're living in the shadow of one of these wells, it's a nuisance. I understand that industry needs to be able to do that, but if you're living there, it's pretty hard to deal with. So we've got to put that on the table and see if there's anything we can do about that. If you're the city and you have that many trucks running around your roads, you want to determine whether you want to impose fees to help with the upkeep of your roads, to keep them from being degraded, or if they are, to repair them. And then I have noise as an issue. I think that sort of goes without saying. That may be an area where the city doesn't have a lot of room to regulate, but there may be some agreements that we could come to on that. And then I mentioned also disposal of fluids that come out of a well. I think that's a very important issue not only for the city, but for the people who are downstream from you. So those are the main areas I think that the code needs to look at and hopefully, tighten up, frankly.
And just to speak to your first point on water, I do know that staff has been in contact with South Adams County Water and Sanitation. It's not a city water per se. They are an independent, another governmental agency in our area that supplies water within this portion of Adams County. And Tom, I don't know if you want to speak to those.
There it is. South Adams County Water is agreeable to sit in and attend our meetings and provide input as needed. But they agree that they're not really someone that needs to have a seat at the table. And they, as an entity, are also looking at this issue.
Thank you. Any other input from city representation, Tom? Is that?
I think that the high level that we wanted to get at this
Okay.
time.
David, do you want to jump in? Give us the perspective from COGCC. I believe there was a little, Tom had talked to you about giving a little background on.
Yeah, is this an appropriate time?
Yeah, absolutely.
You want to do that now?
What we thought we'd try to do tonight is just kind of get a feel for the, as Jason mentioned earlier, get a feel for the what can we do, what we cannot do type issues from a regulatory standpoint.
Okay. And, what I've provided here is just an overview, brief overview of what our program involves, okay? And how we
Right.
address that.
Sorry, can you get the lights in the front? Somebody can, oh, okay, sorry, thanks.
I'm sure we'll get to the preemption issues and we'll address those all in due course, but I think it's informed by what the state's doing and the scope of our current program. So, with that said, I'll try to keep this to 20 minutes, meaning it's going to be very compressed, very short. We've already talked a little bit about the fact our agency has a dual mission. We're to promote the responsible and balanced development of the state's oil and gas resources, ensuring that it occurs in a manner that protects public health, safety, and welfare, including the environment and wildlife. We try to protect people's property rights. We also try to avoid adverse environmental impacts. As I think about it, it's not that dissimilar from the role that the City Council or City Planning Department plays in connection with other types of land use development. There are legal and regulatory issues that arise in connection with oil and gas development. One issue, there's often what are called split estates, where the mineral estate has been severed from the surface estate, and they're separately owned and each have separate property rights. And then those property rights may be further transferred or encumbered with deeds or leases or other contractual arrangements. Under Colorado law, the mineral estate is dominant over the surface estate. The surface estate has to provide reasonable accommodation to the mineral estate. So without getting into all the details, just at a very high level, we're dealing with different kinds of property rights. We need to try to find ways to accommodate both and work through potential conflicts while respecting the interests of both. Our commission has about 70 full-time employees. About half of them are located in Denver. About half of them are located around the state in different oil and gas producing basins. There's about 47,000 active oil and gas wells in the state. This year there are going to be last year there were about 3,000 new wells drilled. Okay, just to give you a sense of the scope and the scale. A lot of development north of here, up in Weld County, in an area called DJ Basin, Wattenberg Field. A lot of development out on the west slope in Garfield, Rio Blanco, Mesa County. That's an area called the Piceance Basin. A lot of historic development and recent development down in the southwestern part of the state, an area called the San Juan Basin, where there's a lot of coal bed methane, natural gas produced, and a lot of development in southeastern Colorado, in Los Animas County. Again, coal bed methane development in an area called the Raton Basin. So oil and gas development is pervasive across the state. The state is a major oil and gas producer. We were fourth in natural gas production, I think ninth in oil production a couple of years ago. So our staff, again, about half in Denver, half in other parts of the state. We have engineers, we have environmental specialists, we have planners, we have inspectors. All of those positions, almost all would have college science degrees. About half of them have graduate degrees. We have PhDs on staff. So we've got a lot of expertise, a lot of knowledge, and then a lot of experience. Our average staff averages about 20 years of experience per person. So it's a well-seasoned staff. Our job is to prevent, among other things, to prevent adverse impacts when oil and gas is developed. How do we do that? We do it through a permitting process. You can't just drill a well. You have to get a permit from us before you drill a well. As part of that, we review downhole specifications for the well. And this is really the first line of environmental defense, okay, is the integrity of the wellbore. And when you get around to hearing about hydraulic fracturing, I'm sure you're going to hear some more about this. It is critical that anything going down the wellbore, like the hydraulic fracturing fluids, but also critical that anything coming up the wellbore, like the oil and the gas, not get into drinking water. Because if you think about it, the oil and the gas is hazardous and toxic as well. So we need to ensure that things in the wellbore are going to remain in the wellbore, not get into aquifers and drinking water. We do that by requiring that wells be cased with steel and cemented, multiple layers of steel and cement to isolate that. And we have a professional engineering staff, and that is a full-time job for them, or an almost full-time job for them, is reviewing and approving those casing and cementing plans. And then we require what amount to as-built plans. After the well has been drilled, we require the operator to submit a completion report so that we can confirm that the well was cased and cemented as permitted and that appropriate coverage was achieved. And we require operators to do certain pressure testing during hydraulic fracturing to provide further assurance. That's the first line of environmental defense. Second line of environmental defense is to review and impose requirements on the surface operations. Okay? So we have a number of regulatory requirements that address surface issues. Waste management, fluid management being a very significant part of that, but also looking at issues like odors, noise, impacts to soils and vegetation, impacts to wildlife, etc. And we do that by reviewing the proposed location for the oil and gas well. Operators are required to submit detailed information on the locations, and we have environmental professionals who review that. As part of that process, we will often impose special site-specific conditions. In about a third of the permits that we issue statewide, we impose site-specific special conditions of approval. And then the third piece of this, or the third line of defense, would be field inspections in response to complaints. We've got a staff of about 15 inspectors who conduct regular unannounced inspections at existing oil and gas wells or oil and gas wells under development, and who also respond to complaints when we receive them. All complaints, our policy is to respond to them generally within 24 hours. If there's allegations that groundwater has been impacted, we'll collect groundwater samples, we'll have them independently analyzed, we'll provide those results and an explanation to the surface owner. If there are violations, then we'll take appropriate enforcement action. I mentioned the permitting process. We require both a permit to drill, which looks at the downhole subsurface issues, and then we require what we call an oil and gas location assessment that looks at the well pad itself and the surface environmental impacts associated with that well pad. The permit to drill is reviewed by engineers. The oil and gas location assessment is reviewed by environmental professionals, a number of whom are hydrologists. And hydrology is a big part of that. Again, this slide is just re-emphasizing the importance of wellbore integrity and our policies in terms of reviewing proposed casing and cementing to ensure that the casing and cementing will be adequate to protect any drinking water, both any aquifers or any drinking water wells or water wells. nearby. This is a diagram of a well bore, and you'll see various schematics of this over the next few weeks, I'm sure, some of which are probably better than this. Understand that the groundwater in this area will be relatively shallow, under 1,000 feet. The formations that are producing the hydrocarbons and that are being hydraulically fractured are much deeper. They typically be 6,000 to 8,000 feet deep. So there's a lot of geologic separation there, practices, and then we often impose additional site-specific conditions. In some instances, we do require the use of closed-loop drilling systems, and we prohibit the use of pits. This is simply some of the information that will be reviewed, and it's hard to see at this distance, but what we've got there is a proposed well with a number of water wells within a mile. Our engineers would review the depth of all of those water wells to ensure that the casing and the cementing of the well will be sufficient to protect those water wells, as well as the aquifer itself. Then we have a number of safety rules as well. We have special rules for high-density areas where oil and gas is occurring in proximity to neighborhoods or to residents. We've got blowout prevention equipment to ensure that control of the well will not be lost. Various fire prevention regulations, regulations dealing with hydrogen sulfide. That's typically not much of an issue here in this part of the state. In other states, hydrogen sulfide in parts of Texas, for example, is a significant health and safety issue, and special precautions are required. But even though that's not a big issue here, we've got regulations that address it, that require operators to notify us and to notify the local government if hydrogen sulfide is detected, even at low levels at a well site. Secondary containment for potential spills. Again, not just one level of protection at the facility or the well site will require secondary containment, multiple layers of hydrologic protection. Let's face it, this is an industrial activity, and there will be spills. What our regulations require is that all spills of whatever size be immediately contained, investigated, and then cleaned up. Most spills also have to be reported to us and the surface owner. The cleanup standards that we apply are the same cleanup standards that the health department applies for property that will subsequently be used for residential purposes. So we apply the most stringent cleanup standards for purposes of our requirements. Conditions of approval, I've mentioned this, that we often apply additional site-specific conditions. Examples would be restrictions on pits, use of closed-loop drilling systems, certain operating requirements where oil and gas development is occurring near an existing neighborhood or residences, certain best management practices to deal with wildlife or spill control. Will require operators to undertake baseline groundwater sampling if they're moving into a new area where we don't have baseline data yet. There's an extensive notice process that applies to our permitting regime. So when we get a permit, we immediately notify the local government. Historically, Commerce City was not part of our program. Okay? The one requirement is to be part of this, you've got to send us a notice. It doesn't take a long time to prepare, but you've got to send us some information, contact information. And that hadn't happened until about a month ago. And now you're on our list. You've provided that contact information. You will automatically get notices of all applications as soon as they're complete. Members, a surface owner gets the same notice. Nearby residents within 500 feet get the same notice. You've got as an opportunity for you to consult with us or to submit comments to us. When we make a decision, we provide an additional notice as to what that decision is, any conditions that we've imposed. If you disagree with that decision as the local government, you can request a hearing before our commission. So like your building department, a lot of the permits are typically issued at the staff level. Staff issues the permits. But local government disagrees with a permitting decision, it can request a hearing before our commission, which would be the analogy to the city council. The surface owner can request a hearing as well, as can the operator. Additional notices are required before heavy equipment moves on to the well site. There's a notice that's required of the surface owner before any heavy equipment moves on. There's a notice that's required to be posted at the road. So there's lots of notices that are provided through this process and lots of opportunity for input and consultation. This is just reiterating what I've just described. There's a 20-day public comment period. If the local government requests, it's automatically extended to 30 days. If a local government would like us to consult with the health department because you're concerned that there are particular health-related issues or environmental-related issues, then you can ask that the Department of Health consult with us on those issues. We'll consider all comments. We're in the process of trying to add some additional local government liaisons who, among other things, would help us ensure that when we do get comments from local governments, we're providing individualized attention in response to those comments and responding back specifically to the local government. You know, if we disagree, explaining why we disagree and what the basis of that disagreement is. Simply some more information. This is all available through our website. We have a very extensive website. There's a lot of great information on it, and that's the mechanism through which you can participate electronically, providing electronic input, and also review application material and additional material relating to a particular project. We have a number of financial assurance requirements. We require bonds to be posted for the plugging and eventual plugging and abandonment of the well and for protection of the surface owner. We also require operators to maintain general liability insurance. That's a requirement. And then the industry funds what's called an environmental response fund, which is a kind of an umbrella fund, if you will, that we can draw upon where it's necessary. Where we don't have an operator we can look to clean up a site or to undertake testing or to investigate something. So in those instances, we have this environmental response fund that we can look to fund those costs. Our environmental program, we've got about, I think, 12 to 15 environmental professionals. A lot of their work involves, again, protecting groundwater and looking at potential surface impacts. We do a lot of baseline groundwater sampling and monitoring, and we require operators to do a lot of baseline sampling and monitoring. We've got baseline samples on about 6,000 water wells across the state. We'll get into this. The industry is initiating a program this month in which for each new water well or each new oil and gas well that's drilled, 2 water wells will be sampled before drilling, and then after the well has been drilled and completed, they'll be using the same sampling protocols that we require. They'll be providing that information to the surface owner and to us. All of that information will be incorporated into our database and will be available through our website. I've talked a little bit about responding to complaints, the importance of fluid management, the other regulations we have dealing with other surface issues, and the importance of well integrity. In connection with hydraulic fracturing, we did adopt a chemical disclosure regulation last month. It has been touted by environmental groups as a model for other states. It requires disclosure of all chemicals and all concentrations of all chemicals used in the hydraulic fracturing fluid. Where a trade secret is claimed, it requires the trade secret claimant to certify under oath and explain how they meet the requirements to constitute a trade secret. And that information is available to us and health professionals. Even though it's a trade secret, that information is still available to us and health professionals. We talked a little bit about complaint response. It's a very important part of our process. Typically, we'll respond within 24 hours. It often involves the collection of environmental samples. If the complaints verified, will require remediation, will require mitigation. We may take additional enforcement action. We have an extensive inspection program. All of the inspections typically are unannounced. They'll address essentially the entire range of issues associated with our regulations and with any permit conditions at the site. We have multiple compliance and enforcement tools ranging at one end of the spectrum to outreach and training and communication with operators following inspections, to more formal enforcement, which involves the issuance of what we call a notice of alleged violation. That would be analogous to a ticket, okay? And the notice of alleged violation requires a response from the operator, will typically impose or require corrective action to rectify the violation, and then for more serious violations will impose monetary penalties, and we've assessed more than $2 million in penalties during the last roughly 18 months. A little bit of information on reclamation. Once the well has been drilled and completed and moves into production, then we require interim reclamation. That has to be undertaken within 3 to 6 months, depending upon the use of the land. It would involve closure and reclamation of any drilling pits, restoration, revegetation, and so forth. Here's some pictures of sites that have been through interim reclamation in Colorado, Garfield County, Wells County. And you can see how the site now has shrunk down to just the wellhead. There's not much left there. Then final reclamation, when the well has reached the end of its useful life, it will be plugged to prevent any water contamination or anything seeping back to the surface. The production facilities will be removed. Any lease roads, culverts, road base will be removed. Pits, any remaining pits will be removed. We've got standards for revegetation to 80% of the pre-disturbance vegetation, weed control requirements, and there's a fairly extensive process that they have to go through to get final reclamation approval, involving the submittal of reports and notices to us and review by our inspectors to confirm that they've met the revegetation standards. This is a final reclamation of a production pit, which is ongoing. You see the revegetation looks like it hasn't been completed yet. Here's a former production pit, which has been turned into a trout pond. We obviously coordinate the reclamation with the surface owners. Sometimes surface owners won't want a pit reclaimed. They'll want the pit to remain as a stock watering pond or as a wildlife amenity or for some other purpose. So reclamation has to be coordinated with the surface property owner. This is simply a slide with our website on it. There's a lot of good information on the website. Hydraulic fracturing, I know, sounds like we'll be spending some time talking about that subject. We've compiled a lot of information on our website, and if you're interested in this subject, I would urge you to look at the website. It's got information we've prepared, but it's also got links to other websites, Environmental Protection Agency, Bureau of Land Management, Groundwater Protection Council, and other resources that are available to you. We've also got some information on our website describing the issue of spills and releases and discussing how we address spills and releases, what the relevant regulations are, and then discussing in detail some specific examples of spills and releases, what they involved, what the operator was required to do in response to the spill and release, and how long that took and what that timeline looked like. So I would urge you to take a look at that as well. Let me stop there. Again, I'd happy to answer any questions. I'm sure we'll continue to revisit some of these subjects as we move along.
If anybody has any questions, Mr. Benson.
What's used in the bottom of a pit to prevent it from leaking into the ground?
Excuse me? What's at the bottom of the pit? Yeah, we've got specific regulations that address the foundation for the pit and then the pit liner. So we require, where pits are constructed, we require synthetic liners, and we've got specific standards for those liners, for the installation of those liners, how they're to be installed, how they're to operate. Leak detection systems, and so on and so forth. That's part of our 900 series of rules. I think Rule 904, 905.
How much more of a burden would it be on the operator to truck all the waste out as opposed to putting it in a pit?
Well, we're seeing more and more operators go to what are called closed-loop drilling systems, where they do just that, and they don't use pits. Now, there's still... Yeah.
They're just there to hold it during drilling. Pits are reclaimed, as Dave talks about. Everything that's in that pit, including the liner. Back to the pictures that we saw, with the pit, the contents are disposed of properly, the liner is disposed of properly, it doesn't...
Let me make a point here. Anytime there's a pit at the well site, hazardous air pollutants are emitted. There's no reason in this non-attainment area where Denver and Commerce City are trying to meet an ozone standard that you should have to suffer an open pit within Commerce City. Clearly, Mr. Neslin has the authority to require open, closed-loop systems. You need to demand it. Industry does it. As he said, it's moved from some 30 to 70% in that direction. And be careful in your terminology. They might try to confuse us a little bit. We want both closed loop for the mud, pitless completion, and a closed loop system for the frac fluids that are brought back to the surface. Now, if he says hazardous air pollutants don't come from these open pits, he has no scientific data whatsoever.
Since we're clarifying the terms here, let me make sure that Mr. Wilson understands. There's a big difference between a hazardous air pollutant and a volatile organic compound or nitrous oxide, which is what the contents of ozone is.
There is a big difference, and there's no reason to have either.
So I want to make sure that we're clear on terms, that what you're saying are hazardous air pollutants are not emitted at well sites. We are in an ozone non-attainment area, as you know, since with your experience, that we contain 95 to 99% of any air emissions that are produced at the oil and gas facility. So I want to make sure we're clear about that. And since you're clarifying terms, I want to make sure we're talking about the same language.
So let's be clear then, there's no reason to have an open pit in Commerce City.
There may be.
There may be a reason.
There may need to be a reason, yes.
Okay, I'm a resident, so I don't, are you saying that all this stuff in a pit and the evaporation, there's nothing bad with that air? The air is perfectly fine.
A production pit is vastly different than what you're seeing up here, than a disposal facility. So a disposal pit is a large surface area that is placed nowhere near a municipality for sure, but certainly out, in the hinterlands. And that may be a location where industry will truck the fluids to evaporate the water off and then remove any of the contents that are left over. A production pit is a temporary facility that is constructed during the drilling and completion of a well that may or may not ever even be used. We use closed loop drilling for the most part up here, but you may have to construct a pit in order to be able to carry the excess contents if there were some well incident that we were not able to control. Brent probably can talk about this a lot better than I can, but there's a big difference than what Mr. Wilson's talking about in terms of a...
But it's the same fluid in both pits, right? I mean, you're a smaller quantity because then you truck it off. But so the production pit is still going to evaporate fluids. I mean, it's summer day, it's...
For the 10 days that we're on a well site, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, just to be clear, there are two different things. What we're talking about in a drilling pit is it's just a pit to hold excess water to make mud with. It's typically not the flowed back water out of formation. It's not produced water. So there's a difference between produced water and water used in the drilling process. So the things in the pits here in Commerce City will be drilling water, and it's not necessarily produced water. So exactly what he's saying is when the produced water is flowed back, it's taken to a place away from municipality and allowed to evaporate there, and that's not the same thing. So don't get the two things confused.
So-
Okay. Now, do you have to, I mean, I understand the mud, you pretty much have to mix stuff up in the mud, but when the flowback or the production fluids come back up, can you dump them right into a tank, or do they have to go into a pit?
Yeah, and
Okay.
all the operations that I've ever been around are all brought back into what we call a flowback tank, which is a closed loop system, and hauled to a class 2 disposal system, or recycled for reuse. So nothing's ever usually put in a pit off a flowback.
I've seen lots of photos and videos where they have a huge pit from a production pit, not a disposal pit, and they got a pipe going in there, and it's coming out at such force, it just spills all across the berm. It's out beyond, rolling down the hill into the river.
And that's where we're talking about two separate things here. That's a production pit. That's
Right.
not what you'll see here in Commerce City.
And Brent, you might talk about the contents of what that mud is. I mean, the water that's flowing back during the drilling process, what
Yeah, typically what the mud is that's flowed back during the drilling process is around here we don't have a lot of downhole reservoir pressure. So it's basically just water weighted up with barite. So it's just water weighted up with mud like off the surface, just to prevent any kind of kickouts or blowouts. So that way you don't get oil and gas all over the surface. It's just water that's weighted up a little bit to keep the formation under control.
Now, we have a lot of, I guess, uranium, radon, those things. Is that coming up? I mean, is that at that level? At, what is it, 7,000 to 8,000 feet? You have a lot of that kind of rock down there?
Actually, one of the tools we do to identify the rock types is using different types of gamma ray. Gamma ray is one of the logs we use. And you do pick up natural sources of uranium, but there's nothing that I've ever seen that indicates high levels like you would see like a uranium mine.
Dave, before we move off this, does the state still allow open pits for production waste? In other words, if somebody wanted to use one of those pits in Commerce City, would the state give them a permit to do it?
I think the answer, Phil, would be that the regulations wouldn't prohibit them from doing that. We could add a permit condition that prohibits them from doing that, and we've done that in some instances.
Could a city have a regulation which prohibited that, if you're comfortable answering the question?
And you put your finger on the important issue. I question whether the city has that authority, because you're talking about the management of the waste. I mean, that's really an operational issue. And I think the state's view is that's authority that's been assigned to the state. Now, that said, I think this is the kind of issue we can work together on. And if this is a concern, and I'm hearing it is a concern for the city, we can look at imposing a condition of that sort through the LGD permitting process. We can also look at whether it's entering into an MOU or doing a geographic area plan or adopting an area-specific order that would impose a requirement like that within this area.
And just to kind of pull us back, tonight was really to kick off these discussions. And I think one of the things that we need to move to here once we're closed out with Mr. Neslin is to talk about the agenda and the purpose and objective of our next meeting. And so one of the things that we took off tonight's agenda that we want to make sure we put on the next agenda will be an opportunity for our community members to essentially walk through a list of key concerns, questions, et cetera. And so two things I think come to mind in that regard. We want to give, as we talked about at the top of the meeting, an opportunity for them to put forth a request for information and material that they can reflect on between now and the next meeting, as well as the council members, and then give our community members an opportunity at our next meeting to walk through questions, give the state and industry an opportunity to answer those questions. And I think moving beyond that meeting, I would expect, probably not during that meeting, but beyond that meeting, to start to identify specific discussion areas, whether it's pits and the permitting process around pits, or essentially we'll develop this item by item list. And I would like to see our discussion move to a point where we're identifying this is in the domain of the city. This needs to move forward in our land development code discussions. This is an item that is outside the domain of the city. This is something that we would like to see Mr. Neslin take back and give consideration to. That, I think, in my mind, will give us an ability to move forward in a constructive manner. And seeing some nods around the table, I want to look to...
Let me just add
please.
a few things. I think if the city goes sort of with an open hand, you may be able to get some cooperation from Mr. Neslin. That's what he's implying, even on this simple matter as a closed loop. But I wouldn't recommend you limit yourselves to that. There was a pivotal case decided this week for Gunnison County supporting their rules, even though the state objected. I just don't think the city needs to take its home rule authority and say, here we are, hat in hand. We can only agree with what the state agrees.
And I will just be...
But that's for you to consider. I mean, that's
I
for
will
you.
just be very clear. The intent of these discussions is not to surrender our home rule privilege. That is not part of this discussion. I think, again, any ultimate decision would be that of the full council, but my hope, and I believe the hope of my peers, is that we can take these discussions as far as possible in more of a gentleman's format if possible. There will certainly be areas, I would assume, that we're going to arrive at that we don't find common ground on. And there may be a need for us to press beyond that. But I don't want to start there. I think it makes sense that if we find those elements present and not clearing, then we'll carry that forward back to council and we'll make a determination both with our city attorney and our special counsel as to what steps may need to be taken. But I think it's counterproductive to try and not take advantage of the fact that we've got folks around the table. So if that makes sense, I don't disagree with what you're saying, but I also want to make sure that we try and take this as far as we can in that fashion. Is that fair?
Jason,
Well, I just don't want you to preclude that you may have to assert home rule authority in order to obtain your goals. Here, for example, the way I understand as a non-lawyer with regard to preemption is if a community's rule can't be made in harmony with the state rules. Now, here's a state with a closed-loop rule. And here's a state announcing somewhat proudly that the industry is doing more closed loops. Yet when your attorney asked the state, can we, the city, impose a closed loop, the answer comes back only if the state agrees, from the state. And I'm just pointing out that the case law is quite different than what he implied. And you may have to insert your home rule authority in order to obtain your goals. I think you understand.
Yeah, completely understand. And I think, again, there's a reason that we have our special counsel on board, and we will reserve the right to take any action outside of this.
And then if I could, just bear with me, just 3 minutes. This will be an area you may not need to consider further. It'll be up to you, but let me put in a little bit of different picture. I, for one, don't believe that contract rights are absolute. I don't think that's what our Constitution entails. Our Constitution entails that government assure communities and citizens' right to breathe clean air and clean water. I don't think the city has to accept a large commercial industrial activity within its boundary if it chooses not to. We're quite familiar with the dispositive case here, the Voss case. Back in '84, Greeley tried to ban drilling within its city limits. At that time, the industry was vastly different. It was after trapped oil or gas that couldn't be obtained from horizontal drilling. It was not using large volume chemical additives, of which we still don't know what they are. So it is our citizens' view that you as a city council or under citizens' initiative have the ability to ban industrial activity that causes air and water pollution within your community. 140 communities have done this in Pennsylvania and New York, none of which have been litigated if they've done it on this basis, not to date. So I want to present that out there, and then I want to present this unique compromise to the city. The way the city's stretched out east and where most of the resource is, presents the opportunity that you could ban pads, but not horizontal drilling. There's a clear parallel within water rights
And
that makes you let you consider that.
I'm going to be very careful in how I say this. We scheduled until 7. We're 10 minutes till. This is domain that we need to get into in earnest, and I want to make sure that we come back to it. Mr. Aker, just...
Real quick, thanks, Jason. Dave, can we use this point and put it out to the committee members and put it up as a link on our website?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then Jason, we also had advertised, since we hadn't changed the schedule, public comment about this time, so we might want to see if there's anyone in the audience that wants to public comment.
Yeah, we need to make sure that we offer that up, and then we need to come back to setting our agenda for our next meeting.
Before we get to that, okay? Now, I want to say something here, okay? Because we've been going on, and we really have pushing our time, and I do apologize for that. One thing I've noticed up there, before we push this to the citizens, put that out there was nothing in there about, I didn't see any residential, I didn't see any playgrounds in the background, I didn't see anything drilling on a match-built community like Shea Homes has right now. So that needs to be part of your illustration or so. I've been reading this, there's no literature on that.
You know, and let me respond to that. You make a very good point. It's one of the problems with trying to compress a lot of information into 15 or 20 minutes and 25 slides. So 5% of the wells, active wells in the state today, are in municipalities. Okay? There are a number of municipalities that have active oil and gas wells in them. And, I think your council, special counsel, represents a couple of them. We have special conditions. I talked about imposing special conditions on permits. We have special conditions that we have imposed when operators are operating near communities. We've worked with operators and neighbors on the siting of wells to ensure that wells are sited in a place that's going to best calculated to minimize any kind of nuisance impacts to nearby residents. So happy to talk about all of those topics, and I can bring some photographs and some statistics to the next meeting if that's helpful to you, if we want to spend some time talking about that.
Thank you.
Just let me make one more quick point. We talked about pits. I think a couple of important takeaways. One, there are different kinds of pits used for different purposes and used at different points in the operation. Second, if the concern is the large pits being used to store flowback and produced water, that goes through a special permitting process. There's a pretty rigorous permitting process for that purpose, with input and consultation with local governments and a number of regulatory standards and requirements, because we're sensitive to some of the environmental impacts and issues associated with those kinds of pits. I don't think we've got any pits like that in Commerce City or near Commerce City. I think those tend to be more out on the west slope. A lot of the fluids, as a couple people mentioned, Class 2 injection wells. Just so we're all clear, a lot of the produced water ends up being re-injected deep underground into Class 2 injection wells through a program that's been delegated to us by EPA. Again, if it's helpful, for the next meeting, I can bring some maps addressing these issues, whether there are any large pits here or near Commerce City, where the closest Class 2 injection wells are. That's all information we have.
And I think in that vein, just to kind of jumpstart the brainstorming for the next agenda, I think we've jumped into sort of ahead of time questions and voicing of concerns about things that may or may not ever happen in Commerce City from the comments that I've heard from folks. And so one of the things that I think would be helpful is to frame the reality of what kind of activity we might expect. In my simple look at things, we have two types of activities that are going to happen. We've got existing wells that are going to be reactivated through a fracking operation of some sort and of some intensity. What is that going to look like? What are the implications of that activity? What are the permitting processes that we should be aware of? And next would be the new well, right? The new activity. So where someone holds rights, they can come in and drill. What does that look like? What is a day in the life, if you will, of that location? What is the time cycle of activity at that location? What is the intensity of activity at that location? I think we need to understand what this looks like in a typical fashion so that we can reflect on that and then come back with questions, putting those things in the context of the Commerce City environment. We can't talk about all things fracking, all things oil and gas. Let's limit this discussion to those things that are relevant to us here in Commerce City. And then from that understanding, I think we can narrow in on what the land development impacts are going to be. So let me just give Mr. Stapleton.
Right along with what you're saying, it'd be nice if we could, little homework for Hillcorp and Anadarko, and was there somebody else? I don't, oh, well, yeah, but you're not doing the drilling, that's okay, but whoever else might be drilling, could you, on the map, say, these are places we think we'd like to drill at some point, just so we know what we're looking at, locations and that sort of, that would be useful. I mean, you know, maybe there's proprietary stuff, I understand that, just maybe you could say, these are the ones we're permitted now, or the rest, we do have some, but we can't say because of propriety, that's fine. You know, we'll just guess at those, but it'd be nice, and then we can get an idea of what we're facing, what it's near.
And just to add to Mr. Stapleton's comment, we had, as council, made a request of staff to try and establish essentially a rough map of well sites existing and planned in Commerce City. Obviously, the COGCC has a pretty robust GIS map that you can go into and look at well sites. Not the easiest to get a real sense of who's active there, if it's really going to be active. Obviously, take some, I would think, some narrative to help really understand and make the most use of those maps. So it would be helpful for us to have a sense of where the activity is likely to occur. And who's going to be active where? Sorry, Mr. Stapleton.
Yeah, just not related to any of the fracking, more of a housekeeping issue. Just wanted to clarify the purpose of this, and perhaps next 2 meetings. I understand we're not going to sit down and say, well, let's see, I've got, I want clean fluids, and you've got this. I'll tell you what, I'll take this. Because really, it's us asking you guys to spend more money, basically, is what it comes down to. But I understand, I don't think we're going to be doing that. We're just all presenting information, and you guys will make that determination. Is that correct? Or are we some point going to hash out and...
I think ultimately our goal is to, as a committee, come up with a list of suggestions to take back to council for modifications to our land development code. I think in parallel to that, as we've talked about, we may identify things that are outside the domain of what the city can take action on, and we want to see if we can get support from either industry voluntarily or from the state, as we've heard about the potential for special permitting considerations, et cetera. So I think there are really 3 potential outcomes for anything that we might talk about. Does that make sense in general?
Right, but the format's not going to be like a Go Fish game where you've got a card and I'm trading, and like, well, I mean, basically we're going to keep it just, here's what we have, well, here's what we know. And that keeps, to me, that keeps it more civil because we're not fighting over what we want and what they want. That's
no, the intent is not that. And I think, again, there are going to be questions that industry has for us based on questions that you have. We need to be able to answer those. Likewise, we need you on behalf of the community to ask the questions, and we will certainly ask questions as well as members of the community that are important to the decision-making process. So my hope is that we're going to come up with questions, we're going to put them on the table, somebody's going to have an answer, or somebody's going to have to go back and get information. We'll chew through that and reflect on what impact or bearing that might have on where from here.
Microphone.
Real quick, I was scheduled on the agenda previously, the COGA was, for a presentation. We had one prepared to address some of these issues and provide an overall education piece. One, hydraulic fracturing and oil and gas development in this area. We would be happy to do that another time as well. And also, regarding Mr. Barr's concern about water, and I believe Director Neslin referenced it, it's COGA's baseline water sampling plan, which we would love to go into more detail at the next meeting or meeting forward.
So the 2 key things that fell off the agenda today were the citizens' presentation of areas of concern and COGA's presentation. I think as a default, those are 2 clear areas that we on top of our agenda for next week. Are there other areas of discussion that we would want to go into?
Mr. Chairman, I got on the mic, I'm sorry.
Let's pass you just so. Sorry.
Thanks. You know, there's a lot of what I would characterize as misinformation, and I don't say that in a derogatory way. I think there's a lot of unknowns here. And, you know, as a company that prides itself on its relationships with local governments, I mean, if we ever end up in court with you guys or anybody else, we've lost no matter what, because we take very seriously our relationship with our surface owners and with the local elected officials that we interact with daily. And, you know, speaking for my company, and would assume that the rest of the industry is just like this. This is a very important discussion to have. We have taken it upon ourselves to actively take local elected officials out on tours very regularly. In fact, we're going out tomorrow afternoon to look at a well that we're drilling up here in Weld County with some folks from the state. And we're happy to offer that up to you all. I think it takes a lot of the mystery out of what happens during this process. It makes, you know, even David's presentation, as great as it was, it makes it sound like it's this really long-term, scary, frightening thing, and it's really not. And when you get out on the ground, we had Mark Udall out on a frack for 3 hours a year ago. His comments as he walked away was, "That's underwhelming." And it's because he stood there and saw what was going on, trusted the professionals that are involved in this industry to do their jobs right and properly under the requirements that David talked through. So I would offer up, in addition to what Andrew had offered, an opportunity to come tour a site that Anadarko has control of. And, you know, we don't gussy these things up for these tours. This is how you'd find any well site as if you walked out there, you know, any other time. But I'd also offer up, you know, since we have the technical experts that are actually drilling and fracking these wells, to come in and give you a similar presentation, start to finish. This is what literally happens when we stake a well all the way through turning it on to a completion. So that might be helpful in addition to the presentation that Andrew is. And lastly, I think you're going to be genuinely surprised at how cooperative we are. We're not here to pick a fight. We don't want to fight, as I said. I think that if you have legitimate, specific concerns that we can address, we're going to be more than happy to address them. I think, you know, the issue for us is we want to be good neighbors. We all live and work here. We want to make sure that you can go back to your constituents and say that you've brought industry to the table to make sure we're all moving the ball forward in a cooperative way.
So in the interest of trying to frame next week's agenda, and thank you for that, are we agreed that we need to re-add both KOGA and the citizens to the top of the agenda next week? I would think that the offer for the tours would be great if we could have members of this committee participate in such a tour, and extend that invitation to the balance of our council if you'd be open to that. Yep, and ensure that we look to see what could be scheduled. I would think that as a complement to the KOGA educational presentation, if you're open to my mic keeps going in and out. If you're open to having some of your experts come and present complementary information, that would be helpful. What I want to get to, again, I think, and I would assume my peers are on the same page, is get as much of that information out as we can so that we can now sit down and sort through the questions that we have relative to the impacts in Commerce City. Put this in the context of the activity in our community, and understand, as we understand that process better, again, what are the actions that we want to see taken relative to that activity in our community. Dan?
Not just the well in process, but I would like to see, and we don't have to go there, just a picture of it and say the completed well, you know, what is this? That tank does this, that tank is that, this is the heater, or whatever, that separator, that kind of thing. You know, the pipes run from the well to here, that kind of thing. Because, you know, we've seen it all, but you go, what is that? And so that'd be helpful too, along those lines.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful. I mean, we obviously have the most recent exposure to this is the activity Hillcorp just undertook in the county next to our Reunion Southland neighborhood. And so we've certainly seen in fits and starts, you know, snapshots of what that activity looks like. And we've had renewed activity over the last week with what we've come to find out is a replacement of a pump. But of course, we don't understand what different activities look like at that site. And so we see a tower erected. What's happening now? Are they fracking again? Well, is that a step in that process? We don't know what these things are and look like. And so again, I think to the extent that we can get educated and have our citizen members also learn more, we can obviously all have a better grasp on this and a better position from which to move these discussions forward. I want to make sure we go back to our comment from the audience, but really quickly, if we were to limit next week's discussion to those three key areas, a review of the areas of concern from the citizens and a review of the operations from KOGA and from Anadarko experts, I think that would be a lot, frankly, to try and fit into those 2 hours. And then
I think one thing you mentioned, I'm not sure the industry agreed to, but it was certainly reasonable to request, what is the full development? What's the other wells planned for within the city? Recall that is not a process that the Oil and Gas Commission produces. They look at one well at a time. They don't look at full development. And I think it is reasonable for you to request of Anadarko and Hillcorp Corporation, what is your full development plan for the Niobrara within the city? Are they willing to provide that?
And it's a fair clarification. I don't know that we specified it as such, but I think the ultimate intent, if it wasn't clear, was to get a sense of what the level of activity or intensity would be for each of you within the community. So if that's something that you're amenable to, we'd certainly be appreciative of that insight.
Provided. I mean, the answer, we've had similar questions. You know, we were just in Arapahoe County. We don't know. This is an exploration phase. It could change tomorrow. But at this point, we honestly, not that we're trying to hide the ball. We can talk with you about our acreage position. We can show you what we have out there, but we don't know what it's out there.
Yeah, I think Hillcorp's answer would be very, very similar. Acreage positions, things like that. But, you know, the price goes up and down. It changes all the time.
Okay. So at a minimum, a sense of what your presence is from an acreage position as a starting point, and we can move forward from there.
Jason, I got two real quick questions.
Yes.
One would be for Dave. You mentioned special rules for high-density areas. What does the commission consider a high-density area?
You know, I'd have to look it up. It's based on density of, I think, dwelling units per acreage, and I'm not sure what that ratio is.
Just have the 603B. 603. It's distance to.
Yeah. But I can look it up.
Series 100
High density areas. If you want, I can share this with you afterwards, but it's right here, 603B.
Okay.
In the COGCC rules.
And I hope this isn't a long answer question. My understanding is that the well in question was drilled got a permit in 1972, and that permit for drilling in 72 allows for fracking in 2012.
I'm sorry.
In other words, there's no further permitting required, that because they had one permit, and this may go back to the misinformation, which is why I wanted to ask, that the one permit from 1972 was good enough for them to continue doing what's essentially a different operation today.
Once you have a well permit, if the well is producing, then that usually is, you know, the only permit to operate that well that you need. It's my understanding that Hillcorp here had to get a recompletion permit because the well had been shut down for some period of time. Now, again, there are a couple of different wells that were talked about at different times, but you know, once that permit is issued and now there's the oil and gas location assessment permit required also that is for new surface areas. There's sort of a two-step process.
Are you asking about the well that was hydraulically fractured a month or two ago? Is that your question?
November.
Yeah. That well was permitted. They did have to get a new drilling permit from us, and they were issued a new drilling permit in November for that purpose.
So there is a separate permit required for fracking.
If you're recompleting a well.
But that's not, I don't think it's separate just for re-drilling. So fracking was kind of included, like the special sauce.
Typically, that's right. Now, if they were drilling a new well, if Anadarko were to come in and drill a new well, they would need to get a drilling permit. They'd need to do a location assessment, but they wouldn't require yet another permit for fracking the well.
And I think this is exactly the kind of area that we would get into when we talk next week.
Fair enough.
Is that fair?
Yeah.
So when we talk the process, I tried to differentiate. We want to understand a recomplete. I was missing the term earlier. What that looks like. Existing well, you're going to recomplete it, what the permitting process covers, what the activity then is that's enabled through that process, versus we're going to puncture a new hole, and what does that process look like? What's the intensity of that activity? And so hopefully Koga and Anadarko can help give us a clearer picture on that, and then David, you can jump in, obviously, where appropriate on the state's role at those different points. Is that fair?
You bet. Thank you.
Okay. So with that said, I know Mr. Benson had just a couple questions, but we have been deferring from our citizen comment. So.
Well, I'm not a citizen. I'm a co-panelist with Mr. Wilson, but I have a couple suggestions that may be of interest to the people of Commerce City. Number one, the slides that Dave had made the industry look pretty bucolic in its finished phase, but they had one well. I think he also said it was industrial, so I would suggest that maybe he get some pictures of one of these well sites up in Garfield County, which he likes to brag has 50 wells in one pad. And let's have a look and see what that looks like, so the people of Commerce City can see what that looks like. Anadarko, in your neighboring city, said that they were going to put 16 horizontal wells in one pad. That requires a tremendous amount of water. And it's also true that that water is extinguished. In fact, it's so corrupted it can't be used again. And I think we need to, well, that's the way it works. And I think that the people of Commerce City have a right to know where all this water is going to come from and how much water it takes for simply one horizontal well. And if you put 16 in there, how much is it going to take? How long are they going to be there? And when will they be back to refrac? And how much water will it take when they refrac? These are questions that are central to citizenship, and they're not being answered. And they need to be answered before the go-ahead goes, we give these people a right to come into our neighborhoods, whether it's here or in Aurora or in unincorporated Jefferson County where I live. It's all the same. We have these rights to know. And so far, there has been no light, so there's no truth. And until we get the light, there will be no truth. We're simply flying blind. Thank you.
With
And
all
actually,
due-
we're happy to answer all those questions.
And I think to limit to having a 2-hour discussion, I mean, it's great, we try to get so much information out of there and all that, but if this takes us, 2 hours, 2.5 hours, 3 hours, whatever it takes, I mean, we're not going to get this done in a month, because there's just too many holes here. And, we will continue this next week. It may take a long time, but there's a lot of questions people have. And I say again, we are being watched by the whole country on this, not just Commerce City, not Colorado, because by having this tape televised and all that, people are going to be watching this over and over and over. So we had to be really clear how we go forward with this, because fracking is not going to stop. Okay, but as far as protecting our citizens and our stakeholders here, folks who have come here on a different mission, we need to see that hand. And like I said, being elected, I live here, so I just want to make that very clear. And so that's where we're at. So when we come here next week, there's been some tough questions. If you can't answer them, so wait till next, go back and get the answers. I know you guys don't have all the answers right now. I mean, and as for us, we don't have all the questions right now either. So I appreciate you guys being here tonight. And let's take this forward and see what happens.
We'll pass this to Mr. Benson, and then we'll go ahead and just in the background, anyone in the audience that wants to comment?
Right.
Similar comments, so I'll speak to that. Thank you.
I want to thank everybody for being here tonight also, and I just wanted to follow up on something that Jason said. I think every member of the council, besides Mr. Douglas and Mr. McEldowney, are the two members, the voting members of this committee. I think every member of the council ought to be made an ex officio member of the committee, capable of being here and speaking, but no vote. Like, I don't have a vote here, but these two do. So, I don't know. That's something I'd love.
I think that makes perfect sense. I don't know that you have any.
Okay. I got it. Also, I'm having a meeting next Tuesday night, January the 10th, in Reunion at the Landmark Academy. And as the gentleman said, there's a lot of misinformation. And the purpose of having this meeting is to try, hopefully, to spread some good information so that people will know exactly where they're coming from and what we have to object to and what we want to support. To that end, this is not going to be a debate It's not going to be an argument. It's just going to be a presentation by 4 experts in their field, including the general manager of the Water and Sanitation District. And there'll be written questions submitted, and I would ask each of you who's on this committee to submit to me some written questions that I can submit to this panel. And we'll take questions from the audience also, although we're only going to have 2 hours. So people start leaving and going to sleep. They've got kids at home at night. 2 hours is just about the limit that I have found one of these meetings can be effective. But that's about what I had. Again, thanks to all of you for being here tonight, and I look forward to being at some of these other meetings.
Mr. Stapleton?
Could we propose Wednesday for next week? Would that be all right? I don't know if, Tom, you had a schedule, you checked on that, or?
From what I've been told, Wednesday should work. I do have a question. Do you guys want to stick at 2 hours, or do you want to book it for a little bit longer just to be able to cover more ground?
It'd be nice to book it longer. I don't mind if everybody's getting worn out. If you can make it 2 hours, and if you go over, then that's fine too. I'd be good till 10. It's whatever.
As someone who has suffered through, I'm not sure how many, I think my wife could tell me how many Monday nights of very, very long meetings. I
Yeah.
would say that nothing good happens after 2 hours.
Yeah.
And I mean that in all sincerity. I think patience gets thin, people start to tune out, and so I think with all respect to all members, if we can try and hold ourselves as tight to those 2 hour windows as we can, plan well, be respectful and pace these things well, I think that'll keep us willing to come back. I hate to see these things get too tiresome and people have less interest in coming and being an active participant. So that would be, I'm open to the Wednesday. I would just make sure that everyone else is.
I won't be able to attend Wednesday evening, but I can have someone else from our agency attend in my place.
So long as we've got somebody from your camp, that would be great. Everyone else okay on a Wednesday? We would do a 2 hour slot, again, starting at 5 p.m.
I likely have a conflict, but I will be able to have somebody attend.
Okay, thank you. So again, simple terms for next week, and then we will determine based on where we get next week what we want to set the following agenda to. We'll get the educational updates from COGA and Anadarko with color commentary as appropriate from COGCC, and we will have a slot dedicated to community members to speak about areas of question and concern. I'm trying to think sort of ahead on order of events. Do the citizens want to come after the educational presentations to see if there are elements of those presentations that answer questions or add to questions? So we could certainly allow the 2 educational presentations to come first.
I think after makes more sense.
Okay. So
It
we'll
may
then
answer
set
some of our questions.
Okay, so then we'll plan to start on, yeah, sorry?
No, that's all right. I wonder if the citizens are in a position to maybe present some of your questions to us in advance in writing, so that we can try to tailor the education program, to what your concerns are.
Would love to have contact information from some of you gentlemen that know more than our combined group.
For
That would be a
information
great
sharing's
thing.
sake, why don't I suggest this? Mr. Cordero, I'm not sure who would make better sense, can then distribute those to the rest of the attendees so everybody can see the questions, and then the appropriate folks who want to take ownership of bringing answers back can do so for the following meeting, if that would make sense.
Okay, I'm sorry. It's over 2 hours. I was, what do you call it, zoning.
Yes.
Send the questions to Tom?
Questions to Tom.
Okay.
Tom will distir to all, and then we'll talk about answers when we get back together next week.
Do you guys all have my email address, or do you want me to give it out?
I think so.
You want to give it to us just for the record?
T.
Okay.
Acre.
TACRE@c3gov.com.
Great, thanks.
Okay. Any other comments before we close the meeting tonight? Thank you all very, very much. Appreciate your participation.
Thanks. So, it's good to stand.